In the world of Fallout, cloning facilities are nothing new. We've seen them utilised in vaults, and we've seen it utilised by the Institute. However, finding it in the middle of an amusement park is a little surprising. Although, if you've seen my previous video on the world of refreshments, then maybe you don't find it surprising at all. Nonetheless, it is what our story today revolves around, here at Safari Adventure. When we first arrive, we are greeted by Cito, a man raised by gorillas, and attacked by a Gatorclaw, a creature that was bred for killing and combat right here. Now, I have covered some of this story in the video I did on Gatorclaws about 5 or 6 years back, but that more focused on them, and it's been a while, so I thought it best to cover the whole thing from start to finish. But we won't be starting with Cito. We are going to cover what happened here pre to post-war, all the way up to the modern day, when we meet him for the first time. If you enjoy this video and want to see more of the content like this, please drop a like, leave a comment and subscribe, because all of it helps out with regards to how the algorithm favours this video. I've added in some chapters if you'd like to skip ahead. If not, relax, get settled, and let me tell you all about Safari Adventure. When we enter the park, we are greeted with the sight of a large treehouse towering over what looks like a god-forsaken zoo. The visitor centre contains a lot of the story we're going to cover, but for now, let's make the rounds of the park first, and see what else we can find out. Past the visitor centre, on the left, we can see a large amphitheatre, or stage. This is where a number of shows that involve the animals were performed. Ignore the large Gatorclaw corpse at the entrance though. For some reason it never despawned. Many animals, given the park's reputation, were probably taken advantage of and exploited here, as the rest of the conditions in the park will soon show. As to what animals were in this particular area, I'd hazard either lions or bears of some sort. Not the gators though, as I'll discuss later. Past the stage is the Reptile House, where 2 cobras gagging on bottles out the front welcome you. Again, the architecture of this amusement park has the subtlety of a brick to the kneecap. Inside, to the left of the entrance, we can find a body with a pram. As I will point out a few times, there are a disturbing number of these throughout the park. Prams, I mean. And it's very obvious what is missing from them, despite the other bodies still being here. It's also interesting that, at least compared to some of the other regions in the park, this one seemed to be fairly populated when the bombs hit. Most of the viewing windows are broken here, and in other places in the park. I doubt it was the reptiles themselves, so we have to leave it to our imaginations how that happened. Although one entry here may give us a clue. We can find one dead worker here, dead from what I assume would be the initial blast waves, as if a creature did it, I'd expect them to look worse off. Down the stairs, we can find another pram and even more vacant enclosures for what we can assume were a variety of reptiles, although we'll get to that later. One of the bodies is strangely missing all of their clothes. Make of that what you will. As always, I don't judge. Past them is where we will find our first terminal, that begins to give us a glimpse into how it really was here. The first entry is titled Emergency Procedures, and tells us of the airtight and totally rational procedure to be followed if a park visitor gets bitten or stung by one of the many creatures here. First up, if you aren't meant to be in the park, i.e. no ticket, and you haven't signed their waiver, you're up shit creek without a paddle. If you do, and are not paralysed, forget your injuries, and fill out a report first of all. If you are paralysed, you can either fork money over, don't know how you do that given you're paralysed, or die, I guess? We never do find out what they're meant to do if they can't pay. Next is Reptile Reminder 787. Apparently some space cadet decided to move some incredibly venomous snakes into the petting area. A petting area for kids? You know what, I'm going to give the employees a pass on this one. Yes, if you work in a space that handles venomous snakes, you should be able to identify them. That being said, a petting area for snakes is unbelievable. That just shouldn't exist. That's Dunwich Border's levels of carelessness. After this is entry 792, and it's short and sweet. Some employees seem to have decided to have a little fun at the customer's expense by stating that snake eggs make great omelets. Can't comment myself on the validity of that statement, but I'm going to assume this entry is accurate, and it's simply not true. Lastly is entry 881. Here we get our first mention of AFAD, or Animal Friends and Defenders, as we should come to know them. Apparently, due to their antics, people can no longer hold the reptiles, and they can only feel them while a guide is holding them. Apparently AFAD has just been stealing them? I mean, honestly, I find this pretty outrageous. I mean, never mind the fact that you're gambling if the reptile removed is poisonous, but how are they getting them out? Are they just running outside and do they keep running? We're in the middle of the desert, or at least fairly isolated from any surrounding regions. Does security not stop them? From what we learn later, they are really, really conspicuous. So the fact this happened 3 times, unless it's all at once, is fucking unbelievable. At a certain point, you've earned that reptile if you manage to get all the way out of the park with it. Going right instead of left, and ignoring the Angry Anaconda for the moment, we pass the section of the park where a lot of the animals seem to have been kept. Given the extremely small enclosures, and the supposed variety, given the cloning facility that we shall talk about later, these conditions are horrendous. Animals that would require facilities all to their own that would be larger than this park may have been kept in these small, cramped and crowded cages. Honestly, this large enclosure for the bear and the one next to it are some of the better facilities, along with the primate house. I say bear cave as there is a sign in the cage surrounding the enclosure stating it is for bears. There's also the not too subtle giant bear statue right beside it. There's also a Gatorclaw and a Yagwai fighting to the death inside the cave we'll look at. However, without a better idea of Yagwai longevity, and given how much time has passed, it is, to me anyway, unlikely it's the same one after all this time. Inside the cave, we can find a very bloody skeleton, and even though it looks like it could have been someone who worked here, based on the bucket and the clipboard, far too much time has passed for that to be the case. That being said, we do find some rotted fish down the back of this enclosure, so honestly, I'm not sure. The terminal here gives us a look into the story of one of the employees here, and shockingly, it doesn't seem to have ended well. The first entry is from a B. Ross, VCU. Ross, whoever they were, starts by complaining about having to deal with some poor child's regurgitation, and then talks about 2 other employees, Tomlinson and Fremk. They think the 2 of them are acting suspicious, as opposed to just not liking Ross, who honestly seems like they have a stick up their arse, but that's just this man's opinion. Their next entry, LSR, gives us yet more examples that they hate their job and whine too much. Also, the Reptile House, for what it is, seems to be too crowded. Fremk and Tomlinson are also acting suspicious again, though if I saw what he did I'd just assume a bit of dealing on the side, or perhaps blackmail. So naturally, he decides to Nancy Drew this shit. Next is DSM, and Ross, Employee of the Month, decides to secretly record, possibly illegally, the 2 of them. Apparently they were somehow involved in, or were aware of, Project Cobalt, which you'll know all about if you've watched my previous video on the world of refreshment. We also learn now, though his previous duties were a bit of a hint, that he's a janitor, and really shouldn't be doing any of this, in my opinion. Their last entry, VCU, was where they quartered Fremk. Now honestly, the amount of information they were given here is shocking. If Fremk was working in close proximity to the janitorial staff, it would seem unlikely, at least to me, they would have knowledge of all of this, what the project was and its links to the military, or at least the cliff notes that they supply Ross with. We shall see later that, at the very least, the name of the project was known to the wider park, but not the details as far as we know. They finish by saying that they'll take it as high as Brad Burton, the owner of the park, if they have to. Now, this is just a really bad idea, even if you don't know the man's reputation, which I highly doubt the staff here would be ignorant about. After this, there's a final entry, this time from Fremk. Now, apparently Ross has just disappeared, taking a sudden vacation. Fremk has been instructed to wipe any entries that remain of Ross's from the terminals. Given that this didn't happen, and he seemed to be under the clock for this, we can assume this was very close, or even on the day of, the bombs dropping. There is no doubt in my mind that Ross was silenced. The only question is just how extreme that silencing was. Our story continues inside the Welcome Centre, where we find a plethora of bodies, and again, a lot of prams. Clearly this park was still highly active despite the early hours when the bombs hit, though it was a Saturday, so it's not that strange, I suppose. To the right of the stairs, we can find a large statue of a gorilla, and underneath, some smartass has stuck a moon monkey. Given the remote nature of this place and Gatorclaws, it's not unreasonable to me to assume this was a pre-war joke, or at the very least one from very, very long ago. Again, ignore the gazelles, it's a byproduct of some tinkering you can do with the cloning machine we shall find later on. I will say, it is quite odd that Dr McDermot, given what we shall learn later, left all of these bodies here and didn't make any attempt to actually clean them up. We will see he spent a lot of time in the lab, but even given all of that, this is just taking the piss a bit. Down the back, we pass a few more exhibition windows for some other animals. This isn't the Reptile House, so I am unsure what they would have even been. And we can find another body beside an AFAD duffel bag. We'll talk later about the 4 or more individuals that were involved in AFAD. Back at the reception, we can find another terminal. The first entry confirms the park had big cats. It also confirms one of these trips had a horrific casualty. Now, every 6 children need 1 adult present minimum. Given the last incident was because of an escaped large cat, I don't see how this will help. It will still seek out the weakest prey, and those adults, whether they be teachers or volunteers, aren't stopping a predatory feline that outweighs them. Also, liability waivers, which I thought only worked when certain safety standards, like the cats not getting out, were met. The second entry highlights why I don't understand how AFAD kept successfully stealing snakes. They are not being stealthy at all. Also, I can't recall coming across a single Protectron pod in all of Safari Adventure, so unless I'm misremembering, I don't see how the second part of the last sentence can even be remotely construed as advice. Entry 3 is from the Grand Fromage himself, in which he pretty much outs Project Cobalt to the whole park. I also don't understand how the packages were being diverted, even accidentally, to completely separate regions of the park. He even tells everyone about the secure beverage year lab. What a smooth brain. Along with this, we have to wonder if only their employment would be terminated. Given what we know, I feel like it would be a little more severe than that, to be honest. The last entry is important, and it's not just because it was the day before the bombs hit. It's also the reason the park is on grisly security lockdown. AFAD managed to breach the cloning facility, although as we shall learn, this isn't as straightforward as it seems. Along with this, the Angry Anaconda construction site is now off limits due to it being unstable. As we shall find out, this is an outright lie. However, we now have to leave this terminal and go to another one beside the body near the duffel bag. Now, in Cito's quest, we need to get a holotape off of Dr Hein to unlock the door beside this terminal. However, we're going to look at things out of order anyway, to get the proper sequence of events. So first off, the ransom note. In it, the AFAD inform the park that they have taken Dr Hein hostage at the Angry Anaconda, and are threatening to kill him if their terms are not met. They also complain about having been banned from the parks, despite the fact they were stealing animals and making a nuisance of themselves, so I think it was kind of justified. Then again, the animals are probably being mistreated here, if the cages are anything to go on, so it was probably a reasonable response on their part. Next, we get told of the various security levels of the park, ranging from chinchilla, orangutan, dingo, and finally grizzly, the current park security level. I'm not sure why dingo is higher than orangutan. I'd rate my chances of beating a dingo in a fight far, far higher than beating an orangutan. The final entry tells us what code grizzly means, and it's a security level that pretty much exists solely to deal with the cloning facility. Only Dr Hein, Dr McDermot, or Brad Burton themselves can access it after this has happened. They say any attempt to get in will be met with lethal force, but this was a visitor center, people were still in here, going off the bodies, and there wouldn't have been a security presence inside when it was locked down, so I don't really think that's true. Now, while usually we go straight to the Angry Anaconda from here, I want to get a bit into this facility, and at the least take a look at Dr Hein's entries, as they cover him right up to the kidnapping. Also, given the presence of the ransom note, at least one of the members had to have gotten this far. Going off of the duffel bag, it could very well be that the body beside it belonged to an AFAD member. We shall soon see that they had Dr Hein's code, and presumably, before Grizzly was in effect, there were other ways to get into the lab. Inside the duffel bag, we can actually find the manifesto of the AFAD group, or at least their attempt at creating one.
We, the members of AFAD, Chipmunk, tell them what our name means.
What are you doing? I have the thing running right now.
Don't just say AFAD. Tell them what it stands for.
I'm trying to do something serious here, Rabbit, and I already have the recording started.
We'll take this out of the recording later. Just tell them.
Fine. We, the members of the Animal Friends and Defenders, have an important message to those who are causing the destruction of the environment. We will not stand idly by and watch our animal brothers and sisters get hunted to extinction. We will take action. We will not remain complacent while corporations abuse our animal brothers and sisters in the name of so-called science. We will take action. We will not turn our backs as...
Oh, don't forget the part about slaughtering the animals needlessly for food.
You know I'm recording, right? You see that red light, yeah?
I'm sorry, Chipmunk. I was just trying to,
Just toss that tape and we'll try again. And when we're done, don't throw out the good tape and keep the bad one like last time.
So we learn of two members of AFAD, Chipmunk, who at present seems to be the leader, and Rabbit. Their manifesto, ignoring all the interjections, is fairly standard for an animal rights group. They don't seem too serious at the minute, if I'm honest. It's hard to imagine these two, even with the help from others, successfully stealing snakes and orchestrating a kidnapping. Given that this was the bad tape, Rabbit clearly messed up again. I'm not sure which of them this body belonged to, if it was either of them, as we shall see later that quite a few of them seem to have died up at the Angry Anaconda. Past the door, there are two other bodies present. These could be other employees already down here, or they could have been other AFAD members who used the code to get in, and then subsequently died. Though we don't know whether this was security or radiation. We shall see later that Dr McDermot was exposed to a large amount of it, so we can't rule it out as a cause. At the bottom of the stairs, we can find one of the two main chambers in this facility, though the actual cloning device is located elsewhere. To the left of the entrance, we can proceed up a flight of stairs and find a large amount of refrigerators. These are likely where they stored a number of their specimen samples, and we can find some empty bags, and some that are still full. Beside the desks, we can find a number of cages that recede into the walls. Seems a bit ill-advised to keep them so close to the workstations of the employees down here, but to be fair, we've seen a lot dumber. The room to the right of these terminals contains a large cage, and a number of scientific instruments. It also gives us Dr Hein's terminal, which oddly has the newest entry at the top and the oldest at the bottom. The first entry covers New Year's Day for 2077, and Dr Hein had a good time. They've created a thing of beauty? What brought this on, and why 16 legs, we'll probably never know. He admits it probably wouldn't survive, but then he uses a term we shall see a lot: my scientific curiosity. It's this phrase, used a few times, that makes me question Dr Hein's morals. The next entry starts with him complaining about the AFAD. They've scrawled "Stop the torture" on the security door, and they've already wrecked his car on one other occasion. Now, if this is the same security door we just came through, then the people in the Welcome Center are dropping the ball very badly. He thinks they aren't torturing the animals, and that they dispose of them, if they need to at all, in a rather humane manner. We later learn it's the incinerator, and we are not told if they're alive when this happens. Moreover, given his earlier comment regarding making a creature that will probably die just because he was curious, I really don't think AFAD were far off the mark. Entry 3 makes me question what type of science this was. I mean, how can an animal come out inside out and then explode? He claims it hasn't happened before, but he also drinks in sequences, so we can't be sure. Again, he says it was a great result, but only from a scientific point of view. It seems he can justify a bad or gruesome outcome, as long as that criteria is met. His second last entry suggests that somehow Fremsk, who we never learned the details of their employment, may have knew more about Project Cobalt than Dr Hein, who was working in a cloning facility that was somewhat secret, I think. I still find it surprising. I am glad he didn't get his budget increase. He goes on about how the animals are living and breathing creatures, but given he says there was hundreds, and this park is very small, I don't think he really cared that much given the conditions that they were in. Perhaps he wanted to improve upon them, but I wouldn't be surprised if the funding didn't just go to the cloning research. The final entry tells us how he was abducted by AFAD. They lured him to the Angry Anaconda by stating an escaped animal needed help due to injury. We don't know if he took security, but it seems unlikely given what happened, meaning he went there after presumably making no effort to confirm the animal had actually got out, and was then taken hostage. He never made it back, and he was held at the Angry Anaconda for ransom, and as we shall see, due to the bombs dropping, this was never properly resolved. Now, we can take a look at the Angry Anaconda out the back of Safari Adventure. It's immediately clear, from the huge amount of scaffolding and the current state of the actual rails, that this wasn't even remotely finished. Honestly, the security report of this being a danger, which was a charade to avoid people find out about Dr. Hein, seems actually quite believable. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on here, but I'm going to focus just on what I think is relevant and leave the rest. The scaffolding set up just behind the trailers, to the left, is of some interest due to the body of somebody we can find here. We can find the body of this individual, who just seems to have made off with some cash registers. I'm not sure if this was a member of AFAD, as there are quite a few bodies up here, and we only know of 4 of them. However, they could have been someone who didn't die in the bombs and decided to have a bit of a looting spree. Or they just happened to be here, and died like the dirty thief they were. The scaffolding next to this has yet another body, but without any items, possessions, or a hilarious pose for us to mock. Now that they're dead, we can't really tell any more about it. Now, before we get into the trailer I believe was the hub of the AFAD operations here, let's talk about this. Now, this has to be post-war. The only alternative is there was a pre-war Angry Anaconda fight club that went way too far, and I don't see how this would have gone as unnoticed as it would have to allow this murder to take place. It could possibly have been infighting from the members of AFAD. We can find some military supplies to the right of this body, at the final piece of scaffolding, but this is such an angry way to kill someone, I have to wonder who this was to be hated this much. On top of the trailers, we can find the body of a woman, who seems to have posted up with a couple of cheeky bevs, ready to kill. I think this might be Robin, also known as Ingrid, who we shall hear about on the holotapes we're about to listen to, but that's only a guess. Again, there very well could have been more than only 4 members of AFAD here, and if so, this could have been anyone. Just outside the entrance to the trailer, we find another body, and further in, the body of Dr. Hein, going off of the holotapes we find, and the lab coat. However, you need to ignore the Vault-Tec logo on it. Also, yes, it is weird that the blood would have stayed as present as it has on a wooden surface this exposed to the elements, but it is what it is. At the least, it tells us that he likely died from blood loss, due to an injury that I assume the individual in front of him inflicted. This was likely Rabbit. The other entrance has yet another body. If we count the one on the roof, this is 3 of the possible 4 members of AFAD, meaning this was probably Mike. It is here we can find Dr. Hein's password to get into the lab I already showed you. Along with this, we can find an interrogation between AFAD and Dr. Hein that tells us of his last moments.
Please, I don't know what you people want from me.
Stop playing innocent, Dr. Hein. We know what's going on in that laboratory of yours.
Yeah, Hein. We know what's going on down there.
Are you going to shut up and let me do this, Rabbit?
Sorry, Mike. I just want to scare the guy.
For God's sakes, Rabbit, you're supposed to use our code names.
Both of you shut up. Now look, Dr. Hein, we know Brad Burton has you performing cloning experiments on the animals you locked up in that torture chamber you call a lab.
I can assure you, we treat all of our specimens with the utmost respect. There's really no reason to keep me here against my will.
Oh, that's where you're wrong, Dr. Hein. We brought you to the Angry Anaconda construction site for a very specific reason. As a supposed man of science, how can you be so stupid to allow Brad Burton to build this thing so close to where you're keeping the animals? Do you have any idea the lasting damage it'll do to them? Well, do you?
Look, why don't you just untie me and let me head back to the laboratory. I'll talk to Mr. Bradburton, and I'm sure we can all have this misunderstanding cleared up in no time.
Ah, yeah, nice try, Hein. But you aren't going anywhere.
Hey, Mike, Ingrid, something's going on outside.
What is it, Rabbit?
I don't know. People running around everywhere. Maybe looking for us. Maybe not. Looks pretty crazy.
All right. Rabbit, stay with Dr. Hein. Robin, let's walk the perimeter of the place with Mouse and see what the hell is going on.
So first of all, Rabbit is a prize idiot. He called Chipmunk and Robin by their real names, Mike and Ingrid. This means even if Dr. Hein was released, they could probably figure out who they were and where they lived. Second, I don't really see how a roller coaster could possibly be doing more damage to the animals here than being locked in cages would, or, you know, cloned to be inside out and exploding. Based on the holotape, I think the person on the roof is likely Robin, as we don't know who Mouse was, and Chipmunk was the body furthest from Dr. Hein, heading out to see what was going on. We don't know where Mouse was. It could also explain Dr. Hein's death. Rabbit doesn't seem very capable, so they got scared and shot him when he tried to leave, once it became clear the bombs had begun to hit. Now that we know everything that happened up to the bombs being dropped, let's get back to the story of what happened here after they hit. We immediately take a look at Dr. McDermot's terminal entries that, along with his holotapes, fill in the gap between the war and when we arrive at the park. The first entry picks up several decades after the bombs have hit. McDermot has slowly underwent the ghoulification process. He observes that the effect it has had on his skin is his body's way of preventing the radiation from penetrating to his organs and killing him. I can't remember if I included this observation in my ghoul fertilization video, but if I didn't, it's a valid and interesting point. He states he may be able to find a cure. Not the only person in the wider park that attempted that, and as we know, it is ultimately futile. Entry 2 is when he seems to have lost his sense of time, and given his comments about talking to himself, he isn't doing too well. It could be, if this had went another way, he'd have gone all out feral. He hasn't met a friendly human in a while, meaning he must have encountered some hostile ones, and he was considering ending it all. I expect if he didn't feel responsible for the lab, he may have went feral. His third entry talks about how the facility is beginning to break down and show wear and tear. He thinks he may need to destroy it, as he can't just abandon it and move on. However, due to its value, its technology, and its ability to repopulate the Earth with a variety of species, he is quite reluctant. As it turns out, he would have been doing a better job if he'd done just that. His second last entry is where things take a turn. He was out foraging for supplies, and the following line is why I think we can place a lot of his holotapes we shall soon see after these entries, chronologically speaking. He found what sounds like a supermutant that died due to gunshot wounds. He takes the body back to his lab and extracts a sample labelled Q334 from it, for use in his experimentation. This is the start of things going pear-shaped. His final entry, to me, is one of the few we can, with absolute certainty, place after a good deal of his holotapes. He is trying to create the Gatorclaw, the creature that we set out to kill in the first place. Notice the mention of the Jackson chameleon. If you've seen my Deathclaw video, you'll know why this is relevant, but to summarise, FEV and its role in the creation of Deathclaws are all linked. He's trying to create the Gatorclaw to guard the cloning facility and its technology. However, he's having trouble stabilising Q334. He has misgivings about just throwing the switch and seeing what happens. I wish he'd listened to those misgivings, as it's clear that is exactly what he did, and that action cost him his life. Given the name and the presence of the Jackson chameleon, it's an interesting question to wonder how much he knew about Deathclaws. He must have at least heard the name somewhere, but was he aware of their source, how they were created or came into being, how it may have been intentional? We can only speculate. So throughout all of these entries, the primary takeaway, at least for me, is the sense of duty that Dr. McDermot seems to have. His greatest concern is not with himself, but rather the safety and security of the machine here. He doesn't want this technology to be used for nefarious purposes, which is quite ironic given what he ends up doing. We can hear the rest of his story from his holotapes, which happened at the same time as his first terminal entries, before eventually pulling ahead. The first tape is the one Cito gives us that sends us here in the first place.
Dr. Darren McDermot, last known survivor at the Safari Adventure Replication Facility, continuing my personal recordings. It's been... hell, I don't know how long it's been. I think I stopped counting months ago. Or was it years? Even with the scientific equipment at my disposal, it's clear there's no going back from what I've become. The radiation from the bombs has taken its toll on my body, twisting and deforming my physical appearance. But instead of falling into despair, I've embraced the change and used it as a basis for my new cloning research. Perhaps this curse will turn out to be a blessing. I just wish Dr. Hein was here to guide my hand. I feel lost without him.
Now this tape had to have happened after at least the first entry, and maybe the second. He doesn't seem to have any hope of reversing his change anymore, which he did in entry 1. His sense of time going seems to be in line with entry 2, so I'll place this one after, as he doesn't talk about cloning research until the 4th entry in the terminals. It's also a pretty strong argument for the lack of cure to ghoulification. He has himself as a subject, and access to technology more advanced than the vast majority that we come across in the world. If he hasn't been able to do it, and at this point, decades if not a century has passed, it seems unlikely that it's possible at all.
This is Dr. Darren McDermot, last known survivor at the Safari Adventure Replication Facility, continuing my personal recordings. I've been continuing to modify the Nuka-Gen replicator to provide a source of food. It's ironic that the very same device Nuka World was using to create its animal specimens for leisure has become integral to my survival. Using a tissue sample from a cow, I was able to replicate a viable clone, consume it as food, then use the remaining tissue to create another. I figure as long as the Nuka-Gen replicator continues to function, I'll have an endless supply of food for years to come. Dr. Hein would be proud of my accomplishment. It's sad. It's been so long I've almost forgotten what he looked like. My God, it's been decades now. Maybe even a century or more, hasn't it? Has it been so long? I'll continue recording later.
The next tape brings up an interesting possibility for the machine. It could have been used to provide a large amount of food in the post-war world, provided it could have been kept running, anyway. It makes you wonder why he never tried to reach out to anyone after all this time. Yes, there was definitely still persecution, given what he was, but even in the park there were other ghouls he could have contacted, never mind a large amount of people he might have been able to persuade. I'll put this one before entry 3, as he makes no mention of the machine's breakdowns yet, and those could have arisen as a result of his tampering with the machine.
This is Dr. Darren McDermot, last known survivor at the Safari Adventure Replication Facility, continuing my personal recordings. I ventured outside today and almost got spotted by a group of wasteland scavengers that had wandered into Safari Adventure. Therefore, against my own better judgment, I'm going to attempt to splice a few of the more dangerous samples I've left in cold storage. I need to use the Nuka-Gen replicator to create some sort of specimen that's formidable, yet trainable. Something that can protect me, but most importantly, protect this facility. It will take some time to work out the chemistry and mathematics of the data, but I'm confident I can create a viable specimen within a few years. I know Dr. Hein would have objected to this course of action, but he isn't here, and I can't let this equipment fall into the wrong hands.
The second last tape would have taken place after his second last terminal entry, but before the final one. His good intentions get the better of him, and he has begun to work on the creature that, ultimately, leads to his downfall. His motivation seems to be solely rooted in his bad experiences with other survivors. Now, we can't really blame him for this, given he is a ghoul, but it is odd that only now people are wandering into Safari Adventure, given how long it's been. or at least given his estimate of how long it's been, we can assume this happened only a few years before we actually arrive. Additionally, I'm not sure what qualifies him to train animals to protect or guard anything. I mean, to me, he seems more like a geneticist than an animal behavioural expert. Then again, we don't know his background, so it's possible he may be capable of doing this.
This is Dr. Darren McDermot, last known survivor at the Safari Adventure Replication Facility. This is my final recording. I've done something horrible. The thing I created, the thing I called the Gatorclaw, they must be destroyed. They can't be tamed. They can't be controlled. Their sheer ferocity is like nothing I've ever seen. And now, the Nuka-Gen replicator is out of control. It's producing them at an alarming rate. Please, somebody, anybody, find my passcode, or Dr. Heins. Shut down the replicator before it's too late. And if this recording should reach Dr. Hein, please tell him to forgive me.
So his final recording, to the surprise of no one, tells us that it all went pear-shaped. The Gatorclaws, shockingly, cannot be controlled, and given how he sounds, and what we get told from Cito, they have horribly injured him. Now, the machine going out of control was slightly foreshadowed, given he has mentioned issues with it in the past. This could have just been the degradation due to the passage of time, or because of his tampering and repeated uses of the machine that was not likely meant to be operated for centuries, regardless of the upkeep. The final odd thing is his comment about Dr. Hein. The terminal entry luring him to the Angry Anaconda was available to Dr. McDermot, so I find it strange that, given he does go out for supplies, he somehow never went looking literally next door, though it could have just been him being a bit delusional due to his injuries. To find out the rest of his story, we need to talk to Cito.
Why bring me here then?
Listen to Cito. Cito have story. Story help stop monsters. Cito eat with family. Wrinkly man come inside home. Wrinkly man hurt. Cito try help. Wrinkly man say he make monsters. Cito mad at Wrinkly man. Monsters hurt family. Wrinkly man sorry monsters hurt family. He give Cito shiny thing. He say shiny thing help Cito stop monsters. Cito try help more, but Wrinkly man die. Cito put Wrinkly man in ground, but keep shiny thing. Now give shiny thing new friend. Help Cito.
So Cito's story is something we shall finish after we are done covering that of the Gatorclaws and Dr. McDermot's. We encounter Cito just after we enter Safari Adventure, and we see our first Gatorclaw. After we defeat it, Cito tells us that both himself and his family are in danger from the creatures that, regardless of how many he kills, just keep coming. At some point after this had begun, as Cito seemed to be aware of the Gatorclaws, Dr. McDermot arrived at their home, gravely injured. This was after the Gatorclaws had begun to attack the park. He gave Cito his last recording, and then passed away. We can actually find his grave, with his glasses, beside the gorilla sanctuary. Cito mentions he's seen the wrinkly man, Dr. McDermot, come out of the Welcome Centre a long time ago. Now frankly I find this very confusing. Clearly McDermot already knew about Cito, because how could he not? I mean, he managed to stumble to his home after being gravely injured, and it's not like Cito or the gorillas are in any way, shape or form subtle. But if this was the case, why has he never made contact? Cito only seemed to have encountered him once before, yet he's been at the park for well over a decade by now, maybe over 2. Why the need for the Gatorclaws, when he could have enlisted Cito's help to protect the park? He seems to be strong enough to kill more than one of them, not even taking the gorillas into account. Yes, he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, but he's a lot smarter than an animal, He's easier to communicate with, and he'd be easier to cooperate with than an untested bioweapon. Dr. McDermot ultimately paid the price for his plan, which, despite the immense complexity of it, was still a very stupid one. With Cito's help, we managed to get into the Welcome Center, go to Dr. Hein's corpse, get his code, and fight our way to the cloning machine, where we can get some more information off of it. Now, unfortunately, the cloning machine itself just looks like a terminal with a jar of piss strapped to the top of it. Not much in the way of interesting information we can get from just looking at it. The rest of the facility is pretty wrecked, with the only thing of interest really being the piles of refuse the Gatorclaws left behind. I believe they were likely using the tunnel at the back of the lab to get out, as the only other exit was still locked, requiring us to get Dr. Hein's code. The machine itself has a few entries on it that are of interest to us. Ignoring the first option, we can look at the program history. The first entry is one of the most intriguing. Whatever it was, it survived incubation, but just emitted extreme levels of ionizing radiation, though that wouldn't affect Dr. McDermot anyway. He's having some issues with sample Q334, and needs to readjust. Now, I don't know what this thing actually was, or what it looked like, but it would have been a great final boss. The second entry doesn't seem to have fared much better. No mention is made this time of extreme levels of ionizing radiation. Instead, the subject seems to have expired in the incubation period after only an hour. Again, more alterations to the Q334 sample are required to get the desired results. The last entry is the actual Gatorclaw 1. So first off, it's highly volatile and aggressive. We're off to the races, folks. Doesn't listen to Daddy McDermot. Check. I assume this study, during a period of isolation, is where things began to go wrong. Presumably one managed to get out, and then the machine malfunctioned in some way, resulting in the continued production of them. The disable command lets us shut it all down, leaving us with a certain number of Gatorclaws out of a total of 20 to deal with. Now, I've avoided talking about them at length, but I'll touch on their appearance a bit here. I do more of that in my Gatorclaw video that also covers a lot of what we cover here. At first, second, and third glance, someone beheaded a deathclaw and glued an alligator head to the top of it. Besides that, and their green skin, they're pretty much identical. Same moveset and means of moving. Now, this does make sense as, and we have to say allegedly, due to the amount of speculation and retconning in Fallout, the Deathclaw was manufactured, or was a random mutation of the Jackson chameleon. This came about due to the effects of FEV, and given the Q334 came from a supermutant, it makes sense there was a similar reaction when it was mixed by Dr. McDermot. Why he chose Gator? I'm not sure. While in Safari Adventure, we do hear announcements of a Gator wrestling show a few times. Maybe this is the reason the Gatorclaws are so angry. Having some tourist laugh at you may have pissed them off to such an extent that the rage persisted on in the genetic material harvested from them. Also, given I can't imagine this just happened in the moats surrounding the northern half of the attraction, it likely happened in the small pool of the Reptile House, which, if that's where they lived, would also be enough to make you hate everything. The only variation in them comes from the albino Gatorclaw, which, given the presence of a similar one in the Deathclaw population, just seems to have naturally emerged. A word of warning. After you halt the replication protocol, there will be no more Gatorclaws. For whatever reason, they never ranged further than Safari Adventure, which may suggest that some of the commands actually stuck. Or they just didn't care enough. We don't see any eggs, so their ability to reproduce is an unknown. However, given the finite amount of material in the lab, it would be strange for Dr. McDermot to be as worried as he was, saying it would be too late if they couldn't reproduce. If there's no other source apart from the machine, then given enough time and a lack of food, they'd probably just die off anyway. I suppose he may have been worried about the destruction they caused, but given that they would have killed anyone who came in anyway, Cito probably included in that, it's a bit of a strange thing to worry about. Going back to Cito's story, we can find somewhat of an explanation to where he came from him, and a letter we can find in the primate house.
This.
Cito.
This home. This family. No worry. They not hurt you. You friend Cito. Mean you friend family.
How did you end up being raised by these gorillas.
Cito very small when first family die. First family look like Cito. Cito not die. Just walk and walk. Find zoo place. Find new family. New family help Cito. Give Cito food. Give water. Keep Cito safe. Now Cito big and strong. Cito help family fight monsters.
So at some point, Cito's family, his birth family, were killed or separated from him when he was just a child. Now this must have been fairly close to the park, as there's no way a child that young would be able to make any great distance with no food or water. He arrived at Safari Adventure, and the gorillas took him in. Now, as I'm sure it's very clear to you, this is obviously a Tarzan reference. We can find more concrete information regarding what happened to his family via a note that's beside what is presumably his bed. So the note is from his mother, and it tells us Cito's real name is Cito. He was presumably too young to pronounce his full name, or he just took Cito from his mother referring to him as such at the end of the letter. His father Marcus was killed when supermutants attacked their settlement. She isn't doing any better either, which is why he was sent away. We don't know whether she sent him off with the note before she died, or she died and then he got the note when he wandered off. She asks someone to take him in and take care of him, and asks them to tell him that they will always be in his heart if he looks for them. Not going to lie, this note is heartbreaking. Now clearly, the gorillas didn't read the note. I think, unless the radiation boosted their intelligence. We don't know. But they took him in anyway, and raised him as one of their own. I have to wonder if the dead supermutant Dr. McDermot finds is related to the group that attacked Cito's settlement. I have no proof of this, and we can't be sure how long before the current events Dr. McDermot found the supermutant, but it would explain how Cito was able to survive and make it to Safari Adventure. If the supermutant was shot at the settlement and died near Safari Adventure, then the settlement may have been near Safari Adventure as well. Now, one of the last things I want to touch on is in regards to Cappy's treehouse and the maze surrounding it. First off, this was where you came to lose your children in. I'm not going to change my mind on this, given some of what we hear over the PA system. Parents came to this park to get rid of their children, and this maze was definitely part of it. There's a lift in the centre of it that takes you up to the treehouse itself. Now, there isn't much to see here, but what is here is odd. First off, on the ground floor, there's a dead soldier on a bench and an unresponsive iBot, just floating there. Near them, you can find a missile launcher. On the floor above, we can find yet another soldier draped over a trunk. Now, I find it unlikely these two were posted up here pre-war, as that would be ridiculous. Unless, of course, they were a response to AFAD, or rogue children. I find it more likely that the two of them ended up here slightly post-war, and didn't last too long given all the radiation. Now, given that lots of other people in the park did seem to die immediately, this reasoning is a little flawed, but if they weren't here pre-war for some other reason, this is what makes sense to me. So this was Safari Adventure, a zoo in this lovely theme park that used cloning and replication technology to populate its cages. An animal activist group took notice, and after just stealing snakes for a while, hatched a plot. They lured out one of the chief scientists, Dr. Hein, under the pretense of an escaped animal. They then held him for ransom at the Angry Anaconda. This situation was never resolved, as this was the morning that the war began, that nuclear fire consumed the world. When this happened, Dr. McDermot was exposed to the radiation and became a ghoul. He spent most of his time in the lab, attempting to undo his change. When he realised the futility of this, he instead applied his knowledge about his own condition to further his research. After this, due to a close call involving some scavengers, he decided to splice together some samples, along with one from a supermutant, to create a creature to guard the cloning facility. This backfired horribly and led to the creation of the Gatorclaw, the machine going out of control, and the death of Dr. McDermot at their hands. But not before he passed on the key to stopping all of this to Cito. Cito is a man we find in Safari Adventure who was raised by gorillas, or ghoulrillas, which I'll have to cover as part of a video another day. This occurred after he was separated from his parents and ended up in Safari Adventure. Eventually, Dr. McDermot would come to Cito, injured, and give him the holotape that told him how to shut the machine down. He passes this information on to us, and we do just that. The conclusion to this quest is a bit tepid, to be honest, and we don't get to encounter any more Gatorclaws after this, which is very disappointing. Seeing them spread through the wastes and Commonwealth would have been a sight to see, much like the tunnelers from the Divide. In the end, we managed to seal another abomination of science away, leaving just all the other ones that are already knocking about and showing no signs of disappearing. But we finally got the realization of Dr. McDermot's goal of keeping Safari Adventure safe, and the cloning technology out of wrong hands. And in this case, despite his good intentions, his hands were surely the wrong ones.